Hello everyone. I know you are watching this video before bed, so before diving into the past and falling asleep, please like and subscribe to the channel. Also, write where you are from and how much time you have. Relax and enjoy. It doesn't start with miracles. It starts with sand in your teeth. The kind that grits between molars, scratches your tongue, makes you cough when you try to speak. The kind of sand that lives in the folds of your robe and clings to your scalp even after 3 washings. Because before the Sermon on the Mount, before the wine, before the world began to whisper your name in fear or awe, there were roads, long, dry, and endless. And you walked them all, not in glory, in silence. The sandals don't fit well. They never did. You tied them yourself from cured hide and cord and bits of hope. They were meant for brief errands, not the long journeys between one broken town and the next. But you walked anyway, with calluses blooming and blood crusting around the edges of every step. Every time you passed a village, eyes followed you not with reverence, but with suspicion. Another prophet, they muttered. Another madman with dust in his beard and fire in his voice. You weren't the first. You wouldn't be the last. They listened because the world had grown hungry for voices that didn't belong to kings. At night, you slept beside olive groves. Not in comfort, but in the kind of tired that flattens the soul. Your stomach growled more often than it filled. The figs you ate were mostly half ripe. Water, when you found it, was warm and carried the taste of metal and root. There were no angels in the night, only insects. And your thoughts. The first follower didn't fall at your feet. He argued, said your words made sense, but so did other men's. Asked why you were different. Asked what made your father more real than the ones worshipped on every other hill. You didn't answer with thunder, you answered with silence. He stayed anyway. Most did, not because they believed, but because something in your quiet made them wonder. And wondering is sometimes more dangerous than faith. You don't get to be holy by being safe. You don't get to be loved by being easy. The sandals wear thin. The hunger grows. The crowds will come later. The cross too. But for now you walk. You preach in alleys where no one listens. You break bread with men who will forget your name. You heal people who spit afterward. You speak in parables that no one understands because truth doesn't shout. It waits. Like seeds under sand. And even you sometimes wonder if anything will grow. You never asked to be listened to. At first, your voice was just another among many. There were dozens preaching in the hills, shouting in the courts, whispering in alleyways. Prophets were a common sickness in Judea, some full of anger, others full of riddles, many full of themselves. But something in your voice didn't rise like theirs. It folded low, like something half remembered from childhood, like the sound of a mother humming over an oil lamp. And because you didn't shout, they leaned in. And once they leaned in, they couldn't unhear you. It was never the volume that moved people. It was the weight. You spoke of kingdoms not made of silver, and thrones made of nothing but love. You said the meek would win, that the poor were blessed, that the last would be first. They didn't know whether to laugh or kneel, but the worst part was this: they began to hope. And nothing is more dangerous than giving a starving man hope. They didn't follow you because they understood. They followed you because they wanted to. A fisherman who'd lost his boat. A widow the priests wouldn't touch. A tax collector with blood on his hands and no one left to talk to. A woman whose name was never spoken aloud. These were not the disciples people would write songs about. These were not the holy or the righteous. These were the ones who had nothing left to lose. They followed because your words sounded like a door. And they were tired of sitting outside. But every step they took behind you made your path heavier. Because now, when you spoke, you didn't just carry your own questions, you carried theirs. You carried them. They wanted healing. And so you gave it. Slowly, carefully. You didn't wave your hand and erase disease. You crouched beside the sick. You asked for names. You looked into their eyes longer than was comfortable and touched them like they mattered. because they did, and because no one else would. You bled sweat to do what others called miracles, not because it was divine, but because it was exhausting. Because every body you healed was another you carried with you in memory. You didn't see the crowds as numbers. You saw them as burdens. Their pain stayed with you. Their doubts haunted you. Their joy broke you. People think power is in the act. It isn't. It's in the aftermath. It's in the silence between miracles, when they ask for more. When they ask, why not him? Why not her? Why not me again? And you have no answer. You tried to retreat. Into hills, into boats, into prayer. And still they followed. Not just the 12, but the hundreds. The ones who would say anything just to be near you. Who would repeat your parables like spells, twisting them into things you never meant. Who would clutch the hem of your robe like it could teach them what your eyes never did. Even your silence became doctrine. Even your sighs became prophecy. They called you teacher. They called you rabbi. They called you son of God. You just wanted to be a man speaking plainly. But they wouldn't let you. One day, a boy came to you with a question. His hands were dirty, his clothes torn. He didn't ask for healing or prophecy or heaven. He just asked, do you ever get tired? You couldn't answer, because you did. Because you were. Because you had not slept in days, and your mouth ached from too many words, and your back hurt from walking, and your heart felt like it had grown too big for your chest, swollen with the weight of every eye that now watched you not as a man, but as an answer. And you knew this was only the beginning. You didn't come to save them with fire. You came to sit with them in their smoke. You didn't come to lift the world. You came to feel how heavy it was. There's a kind of silence that only lives around a shared table, not the silence of fear, not the cold hush of authority, but the quiet that comes when bread is passed between men who have walked too long and spoken too much. The soft pause between laughter and reflection. The stillness of bodies too tired to perform, too familiar to pretend. That is what you craved more than rest. A place where your name wasn't as sacred. Where no one asked you to heal, to answer, to be anything but present. But even that kind of peace came with a cost. Because every time you sat with them, every time you passed the olive bowl or tore a piece of bread in half, you remembered something they didn't, how it would end. You knew which of them would run. You knew who would deny you, who would fall asleep when you begged them not to. You knew whose hands would reach across a table one night, not for bread, but for silver. And still, you fed them, because love isn't trust, it's sacrifice. And you gave it freely. Their hands were not holy. They were fishermen's hands, calloused and scarred. Rough from netting, burnt from cooking over open fires, nicked by rocks and bone. Some trembled when they held your words, afraid they might break them. Others clutched too tightly, turning parables into weapons, but they all reached for the same food. And you let them. You didn't sit at the table like a king. You sat like someone who'd worked beside them. Your robes stained with travel, your palms chafed raw from walking, your eyes red from sleeplessness. The kind of face no idol would wear. You poured wine with fingers blistered from serving. You never ate first. And when the food was gone, you stayed to wash the dishes, like a man trying to prove that salvation could be quiet. They never stopped asking questions. Not the kind scholars ask, precise, polished, intellectual, but the raw ones. How many times should I forgive him? What happens after we die? Why does God feel so far away? Do you really think the poor are blessed? Why does it hurt when I try to believe you? And you answered, not because you had to, but because you knew that most of them didn't expect a real answer. They just wanted to be heard by someone who wouldn't to laugh. You told them stories. About seeds, about sheep, about fathers and sons, wine and wages, banquets and bandits. And they leaned in, not always understanding, but always wanting more. Because your words didn't tell them who to be. They told them they already were someone worth listening to. And still, it wasn't enough. There were nights when the road took too much from you, when your feet bled and your voice rasped, and the crowds pressed too close, demanding more than you had left. Nights when you knelt behind a tree, fists in your robe, begging the silence to send something back. Nights when your own heart felt like a tomb, empty, echoing, waiting, and then Peter would say something clumsy, or John would fall asleep with his head on your shoulder like a child, or Mary would bring you figs she'd saved from her last meal. And in those small, unholy gestures, you remembered why you stayed. Not for power, not for purpose, but for them. You watched them begin to believe. Not in the miracles, those faded fast. A healed hand, a risen girl, a blind man blinking in the sun. Those became stories before the wounds even closed. What they believed in was change. In themselves, in the world, in the idea that maybe, just maybe, something could be different this time. You watched it spark in their eyes, and you watched what it did to them. James started to speak less and listen more. Matthew gave away his coins without flinching. Even Thomas, who questioned everything, even himself, began to walk a little closer, laugh a little louder. It would have been beautiful, if not for the shadow always following behind it. Because belief is just another form of vulnerability. And vulnerability always bleeds first. You broke bread with a man who would betray you. You knew it. You felt it in the way his eyes flicked toward the purse at his side, in the way he flinched when your hand brushed his. He had already made the deal, already counted the coins in his head. But you didn't call him out. You didn't rage or curse or drive him from the circle. You dipped your bread in the same bowl. Because judgment has never changed a heart. Only love does. And even love, sometimes, is not enough. They didn't understand what was coming. They thought this was still the beginning. That the road stretched long before you. That there would be time for more stories, more crowds, more fires lit under dark skies. They didn't feel the edges closing in, the pressure building behind every word you said. But you did. Every conversation now was a goodbye. Every step forward was toward the hill. And still you stayed with them, laughed with them, washed their feet and held their hands, not because they deserved it, not because they asked for it, but because love is not about what people earn. It's about what you refuse to withhold, even when it will cost you everything. They would remember these meals later. The quiet ones, the long ones, the bread still warm from the coals. The way you always made sure everyone ate before you did. The way your voice never rose, even when theirs did. They would remember how you poured wine with cracked hands. How you paused before each prayer, not because you were lost, but because you needed to breathe before saying something that might be your last. They would remember. And wonder how they ever sat with you and didn't see it. It didn't begin with chains. It began with a garden. The kind of garden no king would ever build. Dry soil, olive trees bent by time, and a silence so wide it echoed every breath. You went there not for beauty, but for stillness. You needed a place to weep where no one would interrupt you. Where no follower would ask another question. Where no sick child would be carried into your arms. Where the world could go on aching without asking you to stop it, because even messiahs need to fall apart in private. And that night you did, not with drama, not with fire, but with quiet, shaking prayers, the kind that stuck in your throat. You begged not to be spared, but to be believed. You asked for a cup to pass from you, even though you already knew it wouldn't. You didn't ask to survive. You asked for the courage not to run. And no answer came, only wind through dry leaves, and the sound of men sleeping when they promised they wouldn't. The ones who loved you most couldn't even stay awake. Their loyalty was loud by day, bold, brave, full of declarations and swearing oaths. But at night, when the weight of grief crept in like smoke, they gave in to their bodies. They drifted into dreams while yours collapsed into agony. And still you let them sleep. Not because they deserved rest, but because they were already dying in 1,000 small ways, and you couldn't bear to add your pain to theirs. When the footsteps came, they didn't come with haste. They came with the rhythm of a decision long made. Sandals over dirt, metal brushing against robes. The murmur of soldiers who had done this before, many times, and expected nothing new. They came armed with torches, as if to arrest a fire. And at their front was not a stranger, but Judas, still smelling faintly of the meal you shared. Still holding, somewhere beneath his cloak, the coins that bought your life. You looked at him, and for a moment, just a moment, you hoped he would falter, that he would drop the signal. That something in him would remember not who you were, but who he'd been when he first followed you. But he didn't. He stepped close, carefully, like someone performing a ritual he didn't fully understand. His hand rose. His eyes never quite met yours. And then, a kiss. Soft, almost reverent. As if he was trying to apologize with the same gesture that betrayed you. You didn't flinch, because you'd already been grieving him for days. The others woke too late. Peter rose, hand to his blade. Always Peter. Always the one to strike when listening would have served better. His sword flashed in the dark, and a man cried out, clutching his bleeding ear. Chaos threatened to rise, but you stopped it. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with calm. You healed the wound, even as your own betrayal still stung. Even as the hands that would bind you tightened their grip. Because mercy wasn't a strategy, it was the shape of your soul. They led you away like a criminal. Not because they feared you, but because they feared what you meant. The power in your hands was not the kind that raised armies. It raised questions. And questions are harder to silence than swords. You didn't resist. There were no miracles to stop them. No storms called down. No invisible wall of angels. You walked. Step by step. Bound, silent, eyes steady. Because you knew. Power wasn't in avoiding the cross. It was in choosing it anyway. The garden emptied. Your friends scattered. The ones who'd sworn to die for you melted into the dark, their hearts louder than their footsteps. None followed. None shouted your name. You didn't hate them for it. You understood. Faith is easy in sunlight. It's harder in shadows. You were alone again. But not surprised. Because you'd always known that love is not proven in what people say, but in what they still do when no one is looking. And yet, somewhere behind the torches, someone was looking. Peter, maybe, heart thudding with guilt. Watching from the edge of the trees, hand trembling, unable to move forward and too ashamed to flee. In the days to come, he would claim he didn't know you. He would choke on your name when a servant girl asked. He would weep into his palms when he realized the rooster crowed not once, but 3 times. But that night, in the half-light of the garden, he watched. And even in his fear, he stayed just long enough to see what courage looked like. Judas, they say, returned the silver. They say he tried to give it back, as if coins could unmake a kiss. They say he hanged himself. But long before that rope found a branch, something in him had already died. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was love twisted too tight. Maybe it was the unbearable silence of not being forgiven. Not because you wouldn't, but because he never asked. You would have forgiven him. But he didn't believe he was worth forgiving. And that, more than betrayal, is the greater tragedy. That night didn't end in judgment. It ended in shadows. In hallways. In 1,000 whispered questions from men in power who couldn't understand why you didn't fight back. They wanted defiance, or madness, or at least fear, but you gave them silence. And silence is terrifying when it doesn't flinch. Next, Part 5, The Crown of Mockery. They couldn't break your bones, so they tried to break your dignity. They dressed you as a king and called it cruelty. But even in humiliation, you showed them something holy, something that couldn't be torn. Pain wasn't the worst part. You'd made peace with pain long before that morning. Pain had followed you on dusty roads, nested in your joints, hidden in the corners of hunger and solitude. You had shared meals with pain, prayed through it, Walked beside it like a companion you didn't ask for but learned to live with. No pain wasn't new. What was new was the noise. The thick, sticky kind of noise that clings to your skin. Boots on stone. Laughter twisted into something ugly. The roar of a crowd that didn't know you but knew they wanted you broken. It wasn't hate. Hate would have been clean. This was worse entertainment. They didn't want you dead because you were dangerous. They wanted you humiliated because you refused to be. You stood still in the center of a room that was not a courtroom and not a stage, but somehow both. Men in armor, hard men, bored men circled you like wolves with too much time. They didn't speak in your language. You didn't need to understand the words. You heard it in their tone. This wasn't justice. It was sport. The robe they threw over your shoulders was a joke. Red, not royal, but garish. It stank of old sweat, wine, dust. It clung to your skin like mockery itself, the fabric scratching against the open wounds across your back. They found thorns, twisted them, laughed as blood ran. And when they pressed that crown into your scalp, they didn't do it gently. No, they wanted to see you bleed. Wanted it to run down your face like ink from a ruined scroll. And when it did, they clapped. They called you king. They didn't know how right they were. But the crown they gave was not the one you spoke of when you sold stories on hillsides. This was no throne, no kingdom, no angels in attendance, only soldiers, spit, and silence. And still you did not speak. Not because you were noble, not because you were proud, because there was nothing to say that would not be twisted, laughed at, nailed down. Because the only way to speak truth in a room like that is to be quiet. They took turns striking you. Not to extract information, not out of anger, but like boys tossing rocks at a chained dog. One blow to the ribs, one across the mouth, one on the side of the head that made the world spin, and always that voice, prophesy, who hit you? Like truth was a parlor trick, like God should perform on cue. They wanted you to respond, to curse, to threaten, to weep. You gave them nothing, because what you carried in your chest wasn't rage. It was sorrow, deep, slow, too wide for words. Not just for what they did to you, but for what they'd become in the process. When Pilate looked at you, he saw a man barely standing, bloody, barefoot, mocked, and something in him cracked, not guilt, not mercy, but discomfort. He saw no threat in you. He saw no sword, no army. And yet, for a moment, you could feel it. He feared you. Because you didn't beg. Because you didn't plead. Because your silence was heavier than any defense. He washed his hands, they say, not to absolve you, but to absolve himself. He gave them what they asked for. Not because you deserved death, but because he didn't want to carry the weight of denying it. Outside, the crowd swelled. Not your followers. Not those who knew your voice. This was a different kind of crowd. Hungry for justice they couldn't name. Eager for a spectacle. Some of them had seen your miracles. Some had eaten your bread. But memory is short when fear is loud. And the priests had spoken clearly. You were dangerous. You were wrong. You had to go. So they roared, and when Pilate asked what should be done, they chanted your death like a hymn. Over and over, louder than prayer, louder than reason. You stood in the doorway, draped in red, crowned with thorns, barely human. And still you were more king than any of them had ever seen. They didn't give you the cross because it was necessary. They gave it to you because it was cruel. They could have carried it themselves, had oxen drag it, have soldiers shoulder it, but that wouldn't have been a lesson. This wasn't about logistics. This was about making sure everyone watched as the so-called king crumbled. So they strapped the beam to your back ruff, wide, heavier than anything your spine had ever borne, and pushed you toward a road that should have had a name but didn't need one. You already knew where it led. You'd known for years. But knowing doesn't soften the splinters. It doesn't dull the sun. The wood wasn't smooth. It was half finished, still bleeding sap, bark curling like torn skin. It bit into your shoulders, reopened every wound they gave you in the courtyard, added new ones in the cracks between bone. With every step, the beam shifted and groaned like something alive, an animal unwilling to be tamed. You staggered, and they cheered. Not because they hated you, but because they didn't care. That's the worst kind of cruelty. Not the angry kind, but the indifferent one. They didn't scream your name in rage. They just laughed when you fell, and you did fall, more than once. Your knees struck stone, your palms met dust. You tasted iron, blood, or rust. It no longer mattered. The cross crushed you slowly, like time, like regret, like memory. It wasn't just the weight of the wood. It was the weight of everything they didn't understand. Every story you told that they twisted. Every hand you healed that now pointed at you from the crowd. Every voice that once called you teacher, now silent, or worse, chanting for your death. They say a man stepped forward to help you, Simon of Savini, pulled from the crowd like a spare tool. Not chosen, drafted. At first, he didn't look at you. He was afraid to. As if your face might make him complicit. As if touching your burden might mark him forever. But when he finally met your eyes, something shifted. Not in him, in you. Because for the first time since the garden, someone shared the weight. Not your power. Not your glory, just your pain. And that, somehow, made it easier to stand. The road didn't care who you were. It baked under the sun the same for everyone. Dust in the eyes, flies on the lips. The smell of sweat and iron and urine and fear. You passed women who wept and men who spat. You passed children who looked at you with something like pity, though they didn't understand what was happening. You passed a man selling bread who didn't pause his sales pitch, another who cheered like it was a parade. You saw everything, and what haunted you most wasn't the hate, it was the apathy. Because when they no longer feel anything at all, they cannot be saved. You remembered the road differently. When you were young, you had walked parts of it with your father Joseph, still strong then, still laughing. You carried tools, not wood for dyeing, but wood for making. And he had taught you how to lift with the knees, how to balance weight across the shoulders, how to know the difference between good grain and rot by the smell. You remembered his hand on your back, the warmth of it, the steadiness. There was no hand now, only wind and blood and the cracking of bone. You wondered if Joseph would have looked away, or if he would have tried to stop it. When the hill came into view, your legs nearly gave out, not from dread, but from relief. The end of a journey, even a cursed one, still offers closure. You were no longer marching into mystery. Now you could see the shape of the end. You could taste it in the way the sky dimmed not from clouds, but from something deeper. As if the world had started to mourn before the nails even touched your flesh. And still they watched, some from balconies, some from alleys, some from behind scarves and shutters, but they watched. Because suffering always draws a crowd. And the cross you carried wasn't just yours anymore. They didn't tie you, they nailed you. Because tying could slip, because rope could be cut. Because people could say, afterward, he might have survived. But nails made it final. Nails meant there was no going back. Nails meant ownership. And not once did they look into your face. They weren't killers. Not in their own minds. They were craftsmen, men of routine. They had crucified others. Hundreds, maybe more. They knew where to place the iron, where tendon meets bone, where the nerves coil closest to the surface. They weren't guessing. They were aiming. Because pain wasn't just a byproduct, it was part of the message. This is what happens when you don't obey. This is what happens when you speak too loudly. This is what happens when you dare to be more than the world permits. The first nail went through your right wrist, not the palm, like painters show. The palm would tear under the weight. No, they knew better. They pressed the dull point against the skin, just beneath the base of the hand, and drove it in with a practiced stroke. You didn't scream. You had no breath for screaming. Your mouth opened, but only silence came. because the shock drowned everything else. Then the left, a mirror of the first, and then the feet. Bent, stacked, pierced through together, one cruel spike for both. Not to save iron, to stretch the suffering, to keep the lungs from fully inflating. So every breath afterward had to be earned, pushed up through torn feet, pulled down by the weight of a body already collapsing in on itself. The cross didn't kill you. It drowned you slowly in your own breath. They raised you into the sky like an answer to a question no one asked. And for a moment, as the weight settled, you felt your body betray you. The muscles spasmed, the arms convulsed. Blood rushed from places it wasn't meant to. Your spine screamed, your vision went white. But there was no relief, no numbness, only the clarity of pain that makes time meaningless. There was no future, no past, only the crucible of now. And they watched. The soldiers sat beneath your feet and played games. They gambled over your clothes like nothing sacred had touched them. Your robe, the one a woman once reached for in faith, the one soaked with your sweat and the dust of 3 years of walking, became a prize. Something to toss dice over. The sign above your head read, King of the Jews, a joke, a mockery, but no one laughed. The people said things. They always do. Some shouted scripture. Some laughed, some wept. A priest quoted prophecy like it proved something. A drunk man offered vinegar. A woman screamed your name until her voice broke. And through it all, you listened. Because even nailed, even dying, you still saw them. You saw the boy who once sat at your feet and asked if God had a favorite color. You saw the man whose daughter you raised, now standing speechless, unsure if this was the same man who once spoke life into his home. You saw Mary, your mother, not just crying, but breaking. She had once kissed your scraped knees and whispered you through nightmares, and now she stood beneath a cross that bore the weight of a death she could not stop. And to her, you spoke. You gave her another son, because even at the end, you were still trying to take care of people. Even in agony, your first instinct was love. One of the men beside you begged. Not for rescue, not for vengeance, just for remembrance. Remember me, he said, not prove yourself, not bring me down. Just remember me, and you did. With cracked lips, through blood and dust, you promised paradise, not because he earned it, not because he believed everything right, but because he asked. Because in a world full of curses, he had spoken something gentle. And you answered with grace. The sky darkened, not like sunset, like grief, as if the heavens turned their face away, as if the earth itself flinched, as if creation knew something holy was unraveling one thread at a time and could not bear to shine light on it. Your body sagged lower. Breath came harder. Vision narrowed, and still they watched, because people always slow down when passing wreckage, even sacred wreckage. You didn't whisper your last words, you cried them. Not with dignity, not with serenity, with the torn-throated, gasping kind of force that only comes when you know it is truly the last breath you will ever get to shape into sound. It wasn't noble, it wasn't poetic, it was raw. My God, why have you forsaken me? The words didn't echo. They dropped like stones into the dust and vanished. And no answer came. Not from heaven, not from the watching crowd, not from the soldiers gambling for your robe, not even from the sky, which had already turned its face. You weren't quoting scripture to be clever. You were bleeding it out of yourself, from a place older than words. You knew the psalm. You knew how it ended, hopeful, victorious, resolved. But you weren't speaking the ending. You were speaking the middle, the part people skip. The part where even the faithful feel abandoned, where the mouth of God goes dry and your prayers fall back into your own lap like broken things. You spoke it aloud not because you doubted, but because pain sounds like doubt even when it's holy. And then the final breath. You tasted it before it came a rusted breath, sharp-edged, soaked in the blood that had slowly filled your lungs. You could feel your body beginning to shut itself down like a collapsing tent. Heart first, then mind, then breath, then name. You gathered what was left of yourself, what hadn't already been stripped, or pierced, or sold off, and gave it away. Into your hands. That's how it ended. Not with vengeance, not with fear, but surrender. You had nothing left to prove. No parable left to tell. No miracle left to offer. You had only your spirit. And you gave it the way you gave everything, freely. And then you let go. And the world didn't stop. The ground trembled. Not enough to throw anyone down. Just enough to remind them they were standing on something that noticed. The veil in the temple tore clean down the middle, like judgment slicing through ceremony. Graves opened. The sky held its darkness, but still, people didn't know what to do. The soldiers went quiet. The gamblers fell silent mid-roll. The centurion looked up not like a believer, but like a man who'd seen death before and knew this wasn't it. He didn't kneel. He didn't weep. He simply said it. Surely this man was the Son of God, like it was just now occurring to him. Like it had to be this brutal before anyone would believe. You were alone in death too. The others had fled. The voices that once sang Hosanna were hoarse with silence now. Your mother stayed. A few women, brave enough to grieve in public. One or two men in the distance, afraid to be seen. But mostly just the wind, the flies, the blood drying slow on your brow. Your body hung longer than it needed to. Rome didn't rush mercy. Eventually they pierced your side, not out of anger, but efficiency. Blood and water flowed, and they nodded, satisfied. You were officially dead. You had to be certified dead before they could forget you. They pulled you down like an object. Your arms, once spread in welcome, dropped limp like branches in frost. They wrapped your frame in linen, not in reverence, but to contain what you had become. Flesh, cold, heavy, marked, and they placed you in a borrowed tomb. Not because you had nowhere to go, but because even in death, the world could not imagine that you would need space. You, who fed thousands. You, who calmed storms. You, who raised the dead. Now just another lifeless form. Another failed rebel. Another prophet who said too much. And the stone rolled shut like a door the world was glad to close. But the silence that followed was not the silence of ending. It was the silence of waiting. Because something still lived in that darkness. Not a heartbeat, not a breath, but a promise. Tombs are meant to end things. That's their entire purpose. They are the punctuation mark at the end of the sentence. The full stop that swallows every name, every face, every story. Stone and silence and dust. And your tomb-borrowed plane, carved into the side of the hill, was no different. It had no throne. No echo, just coldness. Just dark. Just the waiting breath of history moving on. And for a time the world did. It forgot. The crowds went home. The city, once swollen with voices, resumed its rhythm. Lambs were slaughtered for the festival. Merchants returned to shouting prices. The soldiers cleaned their blades. The priests checked the box beside your name and went back to interpreting law. You became past tense. Even your disciples didn't expect more. They huddled behind locked doors, whispering half-remembered words, trying to forget the sound your body made when it hit the earth. They didn't plan a revolution. They didn't prepare a comeback. They mourned. They hid. Because that's what people do when hope dies right in front of them. And yet, inside that tomb, something waited. Not breath, not heartbeat, but will. Stillness, yes, but not defeat, not absence. You had not been taken. You had gone willingly. You had walked into death like a man entering a stranger's house, knowing it wasn't yours to stay in, because the grave was never your destination. It was only a hallway. And on the third morning, the door cracked open, not with thunder, not with trumpets, but with breath. Quiet, real, breath returning to a body that should not have moved again. Light touched your skin like a greeting. The cloth wrapped around your face is slipped down like fog burning away at dawn. And for the first time since the sky went dark, you stood. Not because anyone made you, but because you had never planned to stay. The guards didn't see it. They had fallen like statues, paralyzed by fear, undone not by your touch, but by your presence. They would lie about it later, paid off, frightened into silence. But they would always remember the smell of myrrh, the tremble in the ground, the air that felt too clean for death. You left the grave as quietly as you had entered it. No parade, no vengeance, just steps, sandaled feet on dew-wet stone. And the world without knowing it shifted. But here's what they don't tell you. Not everyone rejoiced. Even in life again, you were a threat. Not just to Rome, not just to the priests, but to the idea that death was supposed to be final. You shattered the one rule everyone obeyed. You made grief incomplete. And people don't like unfinished things. Some ran from you. Some doubted even as they touched your hands. Some stared at your face and couldn't look you in the eyes. Because it's hard to face someone you abandoned, someone who died remembering your silence. But you didn't bring that silence back with you. You brought peace. You brought wounds that didn't bleed. A voice that didn't accuse. You offered fish. You offered forgiveness. You offered scars. Because resurrection wasn't just about winning. It was about returning still human. You didn't stay long. You could have. You could have marched into the temple and torn the veil with your hands. You could have taken back your throne with thunder. But you didn't, because you weren't here to conquer. You were here to be with. And when the time came to leave again, not in agony this time, but in glory, you didn't go with fanfare. You blessed. You broke bread one last time. You looked your friends in the eye and promised, "You're not alone." And then you disappeared, not into legend, not into myth, but into memory, into hearts, into trembling hands that would carry your story farther than swords ever could. They say you rose. They say you live. But even if they didn't, the world has never been the same. Because the truth is, you didn't come back to prove death was weak. You came back to show we didn't have to be afraid of it anymore. Resurrection didn't erase the pain. It left it there, etched into skin, shaped into memory, made visible in the scars that even light could not hide. You wore them like open secrets. Not to shame anyone, not to prove yourself, but because people believe more easily in wounds than in words, and they asked to see them. Your closest friends, those who swore they'd never leave, still needed proof. Thomas, most of all. He wasn't a coward. He was just tired of stories. He'd followed you across storms, up mountains, into mobs. But belief is a fragile thing when it's been cracked by grief. And when they told him you were alive, he didn't scoff, he just ached. Because hope that returns from the dead feels too much like delusion. "I won't believe," he said, "unless I put my fingers in the holes." So you let him. You didn't scold. You didn't perform a miracle. You just held out your hands like an offering. You let him trace the price of your presence. And when he fell to his knees, when his words finally caught up with the reality before him, you simply said, "Blessed are those who don't see and still believe." You weren't talking about him. You were talking about us. Even among those who believed, there was still confusion. Some wanted to know if you'd take revenge. If now you would bring fire down on the temple, or drive the Romans into the sea. They saw your rising as power returned. They wanted justice. They wanted the world turned upside down. But you didn't return with a sword. You returned with a question. Do you love me? You asked it of Peter, the man who once swore he'd never betray you, and then did, 3 times before sunrise. You didn't lecture him. You didn't recount the shame. You simply asked, "Do you love me?" And he said yes. And you asked again, and again. And when he broke, when his voice trembled and he wept, you told him, "Then feed my sheep." You didn't rebuild a kingdom of gold. You built a kingdom of care. There were no crowds like before. No loaves multiplying in baskets. No sick carried by mothers desperate for healing. Just small rooms, small meals, small conversations between men and women who didn't yet understand that they were the beginning of something vast. You didn't shout, you whispered. Because the kingdom you spoke of was never meant to be built with bricks and banners. It was meant to start in hearts too wounded to expect it, in mouths too uncertain to preach, in people too small to be noticed by history, except they would write it from now on. You didn't return to silence doubt, you returned to walk with it. Because faith is not the absence of doubt. It's what grows in its presence when the tomb is empty, but the heart still trembles. You didn't leave instructions, you left presence. No diagrams, no laws chiseled in stone, no armies or currencies or flags. Just fire, not the kind that consumes, but the kind that transforms. That flickers quietly at first, then spreads without smoke, without ash. You breathed on them, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally. You looked your followers in the eyes, and you breathed. And you said, receive. They didn't know what they had received, not yet. At first it just felt like warmth, like stillness finally filling in the hollow places grief had carved, like breath returning to a chest that had forgotten how to rise and fall with hope. But something shifted, slowly, invisibly. You didn't light a bonfire, you lit lanterns, one by one. The fire didn't make them fearless. It made them faithful. They still ran, still doubted, still failed, but they kept going. That was the miracle. Not that they became perfect, but that they refused to stop. You told them to wait, and they did. In a locked room, behind heavy shutters, with whispers instead of sermons. And then the wind came. Not from outside, but from within. A sound like storm and silence, like breath and thunder. And they spoke not their own thoughts, but truth, shaped in languages they had never learned. They didn't preach. They burned. That fire spread through touch, not by force, not by decree, but by wounds. A blind man saw and wept. A widow found her son again. A jailer dropped his sword. A thief offered what he'd stolen. They didn't join a religion. They changed. Because the men who carried your name carried more than stories. They carried the scent of resurrection. And it clung to them, no matter how far they traveled, no matter how many beatings they took, no matter how often they were thrown into chains. They weren't fearless, but they were no longer ruled by fear. Because they had seen a man walk out of a grave. And once you've seen that, nothing else frightens you the same way again. You didn't leave safety. You left witnesses. And that's a harder gift. Because safety is easy to lose, but fire renews itself. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't wait for power. It finds the broken and makes them glow. You chose fishermen and tax collectors and zealots and doubters and failures and women the world ignored. You didn't raise up giants. You raised up servants. You trusted your name to those who barely understood it. And somehow it worked, not because they were strong, but because you were still with them, in the breaking of bread, in the washing of feet, in the jail cells and the shipwrecks, in the silence before the song. You never said the fire would make life easier, only that it would never go out. You didn't build a city. You didn't draft blueprints, raise palaces, or lay stone upon stone with the names of kings carved into their sides. You didn't crown yourself. You didn't mark borders. Your kingdom came quietly like seed in dry soil, like yeast folded into bread. Invisible, slow, inevitable. It didn't conquer by sword. It grew by presence. And still, people asked, where is it? They looked for thrones, for flags, for armies marching in your name. They expected you to unroll maps and assign territories, to divide the saved from the damned like landowners drawing lines in dust. But you offered something harder. You said the kingdom was among them, not in sky or scroll. Not someday, now. You said it was in the face of a child. In a field where wheat and weeds grow together. In a banquet where the poor sit first. In the forgiveness of enemies. In turning the cheek not to submit, but to undo the cycle of harm. You said the kingdom was like a mustard seed. So small, it could be missed. So stubborn, it would one day split mountains. They didn't understand. They wanted victory. You offered love, and love doesn't parade. It kneels. It bandages wounds it didn't cause. It feeds mouths that will curse it tomorrow. It returns to the people who failed it and says peace, not because they earned it, but because the kingdom never waited for permission to heal. The kingdom didn't look like power. It looked like presence, in the moments no one notices, in the places no one honors. A woman touching the hem of a robe, a man lowered through a roof, a leper at the edge of the road, a child with loaves and fish, a widow dropping 2 coins and walking away unnoticed. These were your walls. Not marble, mercy. These were your citizens. Not perfect, willing. And the crown you wore wasn't made of gold, but thorns. Because this kingdom wasn't about what people deserved. It was about what they could receive, if only they could open their hands. You left not to abandon them, but to teach them how to see you in one another. And still today, you sit at unremarkable tables. You walk in unnoticed rooms. You break bread with doubters and rebels and wanderers who barely remember how to pray. And each time they welcome a stranger, forgive a wound, choose gentleness when anger would be easier. The kingdom breaks through again, not with trumpets, but with hands. And bread, and light, and the quiet, stubborn hope that maybe the world can be saved from the inside out. But the kingdom goes on. Every time love refuses to yield. Every time mercy speaks louder than memory. Every time someone chooses compassion over fear. The kingdom is still coming. And it's coming through you.